All right, y'all, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Bree George. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to try to project a little bit. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, pretty boisterous. It should be good. We just wanted to thank everybody for being here, for all the time that you've taken out of your days, for everybody that helped to plan this event, for all the committees that are in attendance, that spent time driving here from far away, that spent time driving from near, and we're just really grateful to have everybody here with us today. If you would help me get this started with a moment of silence, followed by the Serenity Prayer. Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So what I wanted to do with everybody, if you didn't get it, we have little agendas that are right over there by the wonderful Jody at the door. She's raising her hand if you'd like a copy. It gives a rundown of the day today with all of our wonderful speakers and some things that are not on the agenda that I think it's really important to bring awareness to is the committees that are here. So starting at the back, we have Intergroup is here with their pop-up bookstore. Go take a visit. We have CPCPI sitting right next to the bookstore. Thank you all for being here. We have the archivist and the outgoing archivist. They've traveled quite a distance to be here with us today. We're really grateful. And we have the wonderful corrections here, also traveled a pretty great distance to be here with us today. They've invested a lot of time and spent a lot of care in setting up these displays and taking time out of their lives, and they'd love to talk to you a little bit more about their respective committees and how we can better serve in these areas. So please stop off and see them. We're going to have a break today, and then we'll have a little bit of time towards the end when we're clearing up, and they'd really love to talk to you. So please take a few minutes and go chat with these folks so we can try to help serve a little bit better. In the meantime, here's what today is going to look like. We start at 10 a.m., but we officially started at 10:05 a.m., so thank you guys. We're going to run through some opening remarks and a few other things, and then from 10:15 to 11:15 a.m., we have an AA history speaker, the wonderful Steve Mitchell is sitting right over here. We've got, thank you, Jody, for arranging the food today. She hooked us up with some really good barbecue. We have Clyde Cooper's barbecue today. We're going to be, thank you, Jody. We're going to be serving the food in there in efforts to kind of keep this space a little bit clearer for everybody. We do expect some more folks to be coming, and I do want to let you know that if you're going to smoke or vape, go out there. We've got a couple coffee cups that have water in them. If you notice they're starting to get filled up, any one of us can fill up a cup and discard of the pretty gross cigarette butts that might be overfilled. Bathrooms straight down the hallway to the right. They've asked us to only use those restrooms. They're having some difficulties with the other ones. And I think as far as housekeeping goes, just don't smoke or vape in here. The church has been really kind enough to let us meet here on short notice. And again, thank you again to the committees for being here on short notice. We're really, really happy to have you all with us today. We have a wonderful speaker out of Youngsville, North Carolina. Jim H. is going to be our speaker after lunchtime. We're really happy to have Jim. Jim's right back there. Thank you so much for coming out and being with us. And we have Keith. Keith is right back there. He drove miles and miles and miles to be with us today, and he did a lot of heavy lifting. He's right there at the back of the room. He's got some really wonderful displays for the North Carolina Archives, the District Archives. He's got some really great displays back there. Please show everybody some love when you get a chance whenever we break. He's also from 1 to 120, going to run through a little bit of North Carolina history for us. So that'll be real exciting. This is a relatively shorter event than in years past, so I look forward to seeing all these shining faces towards the end to help with cleaning up. That sounded like a cat. What was that? Is there a cat? All right. Cool. And then the church has asked that we try to clean up and wrap up by 2. So from 1:20 to 2, we're going to be like roaches on a Twinkie and clean this joker up and try to leave it a little bit better than when we found it. It's important for us to do that. So I want to make sure that we are getting the speaker up here right on time. We won't want to take one singular minute. So we're going to go through just a couple more quick things about, the biggest reason why we're here today. It's maybe not so much to celebrate Founders Day. I think the important part is uniting the 3 districts 31, 34, 35, together. We asked the committees to be here so that we can be together. We can learn a little bit about our history, and that's what we're going to focus on today is our history and how we can better serve the committees in our districts. So if you don't know what district you're in, you should probably talk to one of us about it after. We'd be happy to help you get involved in serving with some of these committees. Let's see. We went through the housekeeping. Cool. I've asked 2 friends to read the 12 steps. Melissa is going to come up and read the steps for us, and then we've got the wonderful Paige coming up to read the traditions for us.
Hi, I'm Melissa George, and I'm an alcoholic. And these are the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Thank you. I was trying to help you out, but I didn't get there. That's all right.
Thank you. Thank you to Melissa. All right, and we are going to have Paige come up here, and he is going to read the traditions for us.
Thanks, Brady.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Paige Wood. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety birth date is March the 31st, 1989. I belong to the Came to Believe group in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. We meet on Tuesdays and Fridays. We'd love to have you. I'm going to read, and I thank you for the opportunity to read the AA traditions. And I'm going to read what the literature provides us is a lead-in to that. To those now in its fold, Alcoholics Anonymous has made the difference between misery and sobriety, and often the difference between life and death. AA can, of course, mean just as much to uncounted alcoholics not yet reached. Therefore, no society of men and women ever had a more urgent need for continuous effectiveness and permanent unity. We alcoholics see that we must work together and hang together, else most of us will finally die alone. The 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous are, we AAs believe, the best answer that our experience has yet given to those ever urgent questions. How can AA best function, and how can AA best stay whole and so survive? So, here we go. We got 12 of them. 1, our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. 2, For our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. 3, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. 4, each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. And 5, each group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. 6, an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. 7, every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. 8, Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. 9, AA as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. 10, Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues. Hence, the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. 11, our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. And 12, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all of our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. Bree also gave me the privilege to rob a few minutes from Steve if I go over. I've been known to go over. But anyway, I'm joking. I'm here because I'm an alcoholic too, because this is a great event to have and to support this in the districts. And also, I represent Area 51 as the current serving CFC coordinator and have our display here. And I would encourage you maybe to come up if you get the time during the breaks. I'll be glad to talk to you about it and maybe answer any questions. You probably know as much as I do, but maybe together we'll stumble on something. I will call your attention to the textbook, Alcoholics Anonymous. In this book, I won't say where, there's a part in there that says never. I know God wants us to help everybody everywhere, and that's our purpose. But it also specifically says never hesitate to go to the most sordid spot on earth. That's how some people think about the corrections, the institutions that we go to, the jails and the prisons, and the men and women who are incarcerated there that need the light and truth that Alcoholics Anonymous provides, but can't get to us or got detoured. So we get the privilege to go there, and so I can help you go through that process to get the freedom to go in and out of a prison and not stay there. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much to Melissa and Paige. And I think lastly, what I'd like to do is thank Intergroup, thank Districts 31, 34, and 35 for contributing to this event, for us to have the ability to be here today, to pay for the food and the coffee and the space to be here. So thank you all so much for doing that. And we only went 1 minute over into your time. It's like God did it for us, So at this time, I have the honor and privilege of introducing our first speaker. Steve is an incredible person, and he's a member in good standing of Alcoholics Anonymous. He helps a lot of folks. I don't want to take another minute of his time, so please help me welcome Steve.
Thank you, Bree. Thank you. I'm a big fan of Bree's. I don't know, that we might have to touch her up on that use of the word wonderful. She hits some pretty suspect characters with that term, wonderful. Oh, I got you. My name's Steve Mitchell. I'm an alcoholic. That is an improvement on Reed only going 1 minute over. He introduced me at a thing, Paige, you call him Paige. He introduced me at a thing a while back, and one of his guys sitting next to him leaned over to me and said, you're not going to have to talk long here tonight. Oh, it's good to be here. It's been a long day already. I appreciate the invitation, Bree. History's fascinating. Some of you may have heard the name. Well, let me introduce myself. Did I say my name? I can't remember. Anyway, I got a sobriety date. It's May 26, 1975. I'm a member of the principals group of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm glad to be here. I've been fascinated with history. All history's fascinating, period. It makes today relevant. I mean, somebody who's never been drunk, hadn't suffered the pangs of alcoholism, ain't going to wake up and thank God for the gift of sobriety. They may thank God for a nice day if they're spiritually minded, but there'd be no need to give thanks for the gift of sobriety had there not been the pains of drunkenness. So I was going to say there's a historian, he's passed away now, named Stephen Ambrosi. Dr. Ambrosi was a war historian and wrote a lot of books, made a fortune, and it didn't help him. He's gone now. But he told a story one time when he used to be in university work. He had a PhD, of course, but he was in university work with entry-level classes. Students would often tell him right at the front, let him know, give him a warning ticket that they hated history. And he said the answer was always the same. It's impossible to hate history. You can't hate history. You might hate the way it was introduced, but you can't hate history. History's the fabric. It's kind of like if somebody's, what's Alcoholics Anonymous? Well, Alcoholics Anonymous is a lot of things. It's a way of life more powerful than the illness of alcoholism. But it's like food, water, air, and sunshine. It's my purpose in life. It's what's given me life. It's what's made it possible to live in the world. So I've had two things in my life that have, I fit in two places. One was drinking. That ended, though. Even people that sold booze ended up not accepting my drinking. And the other place I've found my way is in Alcoholics Anonymous. So both of them have transformed my life. If you look at it, the way, well, you know, booze was mystical and magical in the beginning. It made it possible for me to live in the world, and that's what Alcoholics Anonymous has done. So I'm going to try to frame this. A lot of stuff passes through your mind. I was doing one of those things. There was a crowd, probably twice this big, but I was in Oracle, Arizona, and it was one of those AA weekends where people gathered up and they get somebody to talk about the steps all weekend. And a reasonable group of people sitting around just like this, and a rattlesnake came. I mean, a literal rattlesnake showed up there at the thing. Now, that'll get your attention. You know, we might have some problems here today. I don't know what'll happen, but I'm pretty sure a rattlesnake ain't going to come. And a guy actually picked up the rattlesnake and took it out. And he went right by where I was sitting on a bench. And the next day, he's the guy that took me to the airport. And he said, what do you think about the way I handled that rattlesnake? I said, well, pretty impressive. He said, well, it wasn't a John Wayne move. He said, when I was a kid, I worked on a ranch, and they teach you how to handle rattlesnakes. You can't work on the ranch. There's a lot of them in Arizona. And he told me he said it was impossible for the snake to bite him the way he was holding it. He said the way people get bit by the snake is the way they release it. And I said, well, I don't know about all that, young man, but it was impressive. He said, well, it might have been. But he said, if you put a woman in front of me, I'll fall apart every time. So, you know, we've all got our demons. But anyway, hey, Newt. I'm glad to be here, and I'm not an expert on history. I'm not an expert on anything. I'm not a historian. I'm a guy that's fascinated by history, all kinds of history, particularly Alcoholics Anonymous history. I'm not an expert on Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not a counselor. I'm not an authority. I'm nothing. What I am is a guy that Alcoholics Anonymous has worked awfully well for. So I'm going to take a couple minutes, that's all, and identify my alcoholism. I'm not here on moral grounds. I'm all for drinking. That's where we get our members. I'm just not for it for me. I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, 25, almost 26 years old, hemorrhaging blood. Went to the bathroom, blood came out. When I vomited, blood come out. I'd been homeless for a couple years. I was turning colors. My feet were swollen up. And I came to Alcoholics Anonymous running away from what I had. I didn't know this at the time. There was no way for me to know this, but I was just right for Alcoholics Anonymous. And the reason that is that I had made a proclamation in my heart that I had to find a new way to live or I wanted to die. Couldn't take any more failure. Something had to give. So I was just right for Alcoholics Anonymous. There's been that old refrain for years that AA works best as a court of last resort. I wouldn't quibble with that, but you could probably say it only works as a court of last resort. I can't imagine an alcoholic having a choice to drink that wouldn't drink. I mean, come on. That doesn't even seem realistic. So what I'd like to do, I want to frame this around, I'm going to move away from this pretty quick, but lest I forget. I want to frame this around about the underpinnings and the beginnings of Alcoholics Anonymous as we know it today with 3 little short readings, and I'm going to get out of that and bounce around a little bit. I've never learned how to talk from notes. I never talk from notes, but sometimes with workshops I'll jot down some stuff, and here's what it does for me. It helps me from bouncing all over. Doesn't stop it, but it helps. If that bouncing around gets too bad, sometimes I forget where I'm at. And it's never embarrassing. Here's when it becomes embarrassing, if there ain't anybody else listening. I mean, if I forget where I'm at, somebody's got to get me going, all right? That's a little embarrassing when there ain't anybody listening. So I read these things. I've always, or at least for a long part of my sobriety, I've taken some good time in the morning. I think the virus lengthened that. It takes me a couple hours in the morning to get done with my readings and prayers and settle in. And time just flies with that. But I read these 3 things every day, and I like to frame this around the underpinnings of Alcoholics Anonymous about what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now, kind of how we're guided to tell our stories. I'm not a word technician. People can do what they want, but about 75% of the time when people say what they're going to do or when somebody introduces them, they say they're going to talk about what it used to be like, what happened, and what it's like now. You even read that sometimes in the grapevine. I would submit that changes the whole drill. We're supposed to be talking about what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. So I want to frame this around 3 little things. There's a couple readings in the chapter to the agnostics where it says, when we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis we could not postpone or evade, we had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What was our choice to be? People were in pretty bad trouble when Alcoholics Anonymous started. There's a guy in my group always likes to say he wasn't on a roll when he came to AA. We hear that often. Nobody's on a roll when they come to AA. And so the next thing I'd like to read, this offers a little bit of hope here. I would say, I love those, like that sentence, there is a solution. That's a declarative statement. It's just a statement of fact. There's no conjecture in that. There's no debate to that. It's just a fact. So if somebody were to ask me what I think Alcoholics Anonymous is, I'd say it's a way of life more powerful than the illness of alcoholism if all the stuff is applied. That's what I would say it is. If that were not the case, then we would have to bail out. It'd be a crapshoot whether somebody stayed sober or not. All the things Alcoholics Anonymous can do, one thing it can't do, it can't stop life from coming at us. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Once we sensitize and take our place, life starts to come sometimes point-blank range. So most people get more problems after they quit drinking. So we take our place. And if somebody were to ask me what alcoholism is, I would say what it means to me is I can't live with drinking and I can't live without drinking. If you look at the overwhelming percentage, if you break that down like a statistician does, alcoholics usually don't kill themselves when they're drinking. We kill ourselves more sober. I mean, I heard a guy make a talk. He was in rescue mission work for over 50 years. He said he never knew of an alcoholic commit suicide on Skid Row. Alcoholics die there every day. I've been on that Skid Row. They're not dramatizing that. It's like people they've almost got them stacked. And people die every day there. Their liver shuts down. There's all these stabbings now, the COVID, whatever. They just run out. They're done. They shut down. They die. They fall in the gutter. The bus runs over them. Said he'd never known a single one to commit suicide. Now, you could argue we're killing ourselves with our drinking. I think you could probably argue that correctly. But anyway, the Alcoholics Anonymous is more powerful than alcoholism, and that's what our founders through God have gifted us with. So what we're doing today is we're participating in our own recovery. So Bree's exactly right. If you don't leave here any smarter than you are now, you still hit a home run. The way I like to look on it is dark, active alcoholism, light recovery. So the illness breeds itself in isolation. Recovery breeds itself in community. So I don't know if the selfishness of alcoholism or the loneliness of alcoholism is worse than other kinds of loneliness, but it's different because it doesn't have anything to do with the proximity of people. You can be alone in the arms of a loving woman. You can be alone in your own family at Christmas time. And I suspect one of the loneliest places in the whole world is Alcoholics Anonymous if it's not your deal. If you've been forced in against your will. They forced my dad into AA for years. They wore out probably one car, taking him around to get him to quit drinking. He hated Alcoholics Anonymous. He told his sister, one of my aunts, he said, if anything can make a man drink, AA would do it. He hated it. Hated everything about it. So I want to frame the second part of this about coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. We can only clear the ground a bit if our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself. Then, if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. Broad highway is capitalized. It's talking about spiritual things. With this attitude, you can't fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. And that whole chapter to the agnostics is riddled with the word prejudice. The problem with that is I don't see it as prejudice when I get in front of something going on. I just see it as that's the way it is. But the reason that's the way it is because I'm prejudiced. So they knew what they were talking about. And the other thing I would like to finish this little opening with is taken out of the first couple paragraphs out of working with others. And it's foundational. We've only got two things we do in Alcoholics Anonymous, so far as I know. I've said this all over the country. No one's ever challenged it. I could be wrong, but so far as I know, of all the hundreds of things we do, somebody set this up, Bree coordinated with, what was that lady's name? Angela, the minister. All of the stuff. Somebody's a GSR, Newt was a delegate and trustee. We pick up people from halfway houses. We go on 12-step calls. We set up meetings. All the things we do. As far as I know, everything we do is to stay sober and to carry the message to the alcoholic who still suffers. That comes under the broad brush. But anyway, I love this couple things here. This couple paragraphs, very short, and I'll launch off on this. Reed took quite a bit of my time, so. When this story is told, it'll be like 10 or 15 minutes extra that he took. This is out of the chapter, Working with Others, which is a textbook, How to Work with Others. It gives us concrete suggestions. By the way, anybody who's really a historian and really interested in Alcoholics Anonymous writings, I'm just going to make this is a bit of an editorial. There's a thing around the country that the big book is divinely inspired, and the 12 and 12 is one step this side of recovery porn. Well, that's the most silly thing I've ever heard in my life. The 12 and 12 is a wonderful book. I'm not an expert, but as far as I know, Bill never wrote again anywhere the way he wrote the big book. Never. The big book goes right at you. It'll tell you what will happen if you do what you're supposed to do, and it'll tell you what will happen if you don't do what you're supposed to do. It doesn't give you much room. The 12 and 12 and other writings, Bill's letters, all of that stuff, you can get a good compilation of Bill's writings in that little book as Bill sees it. It's got all kinds of stuff in there that he wrote. As far as I know, he never wrote in that in-your-face manner. I've always thought that there was probably a lot of other people helping with this. I know that there's questions about all of that. But you got to remember, people's lives were on the line at that time. So when he wrote the 12 and 12 later, Bill was one of the most broad-minded thinkers. I mean, the example I like to use, we got people changing their sex today. If Bill Wilson were here, he would not think a thing in the world of that. Now, Dr. Bob, you're going to have some problems with him. But Bill would not think a thing in the world of that. That not wanting women in AA, Bill thought that was silly. Not wanting blacks, Bill thought that was silly. Whatever it was that wasn't wanted, Bill thought it was silly. He said, come on. So, anyway, working with others. This is the job description they left us with. If you really wanted to be, anyway. Practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. It works when other activities fail. This is our 12th suggestion. Carry this message to other alcoholics. You can help when no one else can. You can secure their confidence when others fail. Remember, they are very ill. Life will take on new meaning, to watch people recover, to see them help others, to watch loneliness vanish, to see a fellowship grow up about you, to have a host of friends. This is an experience you must not miss. We know you will not want to miss it. Frequent contact with newcomers and with each other is the bright spot of our lives. One more couple sentences read here. On top of, right after the sixth and seventh step, when it moves us over, one of the big book has 8 and 9 is all run together. It's all globbed up. It's good concrete instructions, but here's at the top of page 77. And it tells you what our job is. At the end of those 3 things that I just read, they've left us with something to do. I don't think we were given this gift. I heard one guy say, I wasn't given this gift to stay home and watch Gunsmoke. So that's a while ago, because Gunsmoke. It says at the top of page 77 and starting into step 8, we might prejudice them. At the moment, we are trying to put our lives in order. But this is not an end in itself. Our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. So, while we've got a lot of stuff in our literature, some of it's, no matter how complicated or whatever it might seem, it's pretty simple. The difficulty is in practicing it. But it's fairly simple to understand. But when I first looked at the 11th step, it looked like something otherworldly. But if you break that down to the quickest way between first and second base, a straight line, if someone's an alcoholic and they're almost dead from drinking, you would assume that God's will would be you don't drink. I don't want to hit you with anything too heavy in here, but that would seem to make sense. So, anyway, when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, AA was 40 years old. And it was a different time in our world. We were coming out of the Vietnam era. Bill had only been dead 4 years. Now, Dr. Bob passed in 1950. Almost any AA member's home or office you would go into, if they were an active member, there would be a letter in a frame from Bill. Some short writing, and it would be signed by Bill. And then it came to the point where he said he wasn't going to be able to do that anymore. He was going to keep up with us through the grapevine. So if Bill were alive today, he'd be wearing out email and all of that stuff. It was a very different time. There was a guy in Omaha, I knew him well. Bill used to stay at his house. Don Farrell, he was the first delegate and first trustee from Nebraska. And there's trust me on this now, I'm a big fan of Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob. I'm just telling you what Don Farrell said. They were very close friends. But you know that thing in there where it says that half of the people sobered up immediately and the other half got sober after some time and everything? Don Farrell said that was never even close. He said, look, I was a dear friend of Bill. Bill and Lois used to stay with my wife and I. Everybody knew that. He was some kind of local hero in the AA community. Great man. He said, Bill never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So it's just something to think about. And the recent readings, there's been some effort to catch Dr. Bob up and all that. That's what that book was about, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. I think came out in 1980. One of the reasons was that is all the credit had went to Akron. But there's a book out. It's not conference-approved AA literature. Bible isn't either. There's a lot of good stuff to read in addition to AA literature, not instead of. But there's a book out. It's a scholarly account. I think it took 7 years to put together, called Writing the Big Book. And it really desanctifies Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob has always been my main man, but he kind of desanctifies him. We heard Sue Windowsmith in 1995, Dr. Bob's adopted daughter. We heard her speak in San Diego. And she was coming off of about 40 years of resentment towards Alcoholics Anonymous and had got things straight by that time. But you know that line in the book, where in Dr. Bob's story, where he says his home life is ideal? She said, ain't nobody asked me. And then there's also a book, it's out of print, I've read it, it's a tough read, it's a tough read, but it's called The Children of the Healer. And it's about Dr. Bob's son. They called him, last time we heard him talk in Minneapolis, Sandy was there, Reed was there, I don't know if anybody else in here was there. In 2000 we heard him talk in Minneapolis, and he was about 85 at that time. They called him Young Bob. But he said that the room wasn't much bigger than this. You know, if you've been to an international, there's Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday morning when we're all together in the ballpark. But the rest of the time, the meetings can go like this to maybe a couple, 300 sometimes. But there were probably 100 of us or so jammed in a room, and they asked Dr. Bob's son, is it true? He's the one that had to give up his bed when Bill Wilson came to stay. And he's the last living human. He's gone now too, of course, but he was the last living human that was there when his dad and Bill Wilson met that night for what's now been described as 6 hours. Dr. Bob said, I'll give this, I don't know what he called him, clown or something. I'll give him 15 minutes. And they left 6 hours later. But they asked Dr. Bob's son, because he was often in the room with him, he said, is it true that your dad and Bill Wilson never had an argument? It was spontaneous. It wasn't sifted questions. Just people like you and me asking the questions. And he said, as far as I know, that's true. He said they were both brilliant men, but their minds worked in very different ways and came at problems from very different ways. And he said, now, had it been up to my dad, well, let's do Bill Wilson first. He said had it been up to Bill Wilson alone, he'd have tried to franchise and sell AA. If it would have been up to my dad, AA never would have got out of Ohio. He said to say that my dad was conservative and a slow mover is very much... He said, my dad married my mom after a 16-and-a-half-year whirlwind courtship. About 16 weeks is all you can hang with whirlwind. Sometimes I couldn't make it. I was pretty good at getting women. Sometimes I couldn't get them through the next morning. But I mean, I was 16 hours sometimes would have looked good. So, I mean, 16 and a half years, you ain't a whirlwind now. But anyway, so it's very, very interesting. So we're gonna move out of that now, and let me try to track my time here. I got a problem with time too. What time did I start, Bree? 15 seconds, 11:15. Okay. There was actually a time. It's been a long time ago. I worried about taking up the time. That's been a long time ago. Time flies when you're up here. Well, the illness of alcoholism. If you read the Bible, other things, if you look at family history. I used to do family histories. My first responsible job when I got sober was in the court system with state probation. Nebraska judges don't sentence people without a pre-sentence investigation like they do in North Carolina. When an admission or a finding of guilt, the judge orders a pre-sentence investigation. I used to do those for the court and monitor probation, so I was trained on how to do family histories. And I'll assure you, if you look very far in any family, you're going to find some squalor. Nobody misses it. It might not be readily evident, but nobody misses it, and there's always alcoholism looming somewhere. Some families whittled way more than others, but you can sit in AA meetings and hear somebody. This happens all the time. I don't know how many of us come from alcoholic families, but you can hear people say all the time, I said, I'll never be like her, or I'll never be like him, usually followed up with, I turned out worse. Is usually the way it is. So we do know that this stuff runs in families. We know it's been a terrible problem forever and ever. So there's always been people that found some kind of an answer. It's not true that my experience is that a much better indication of alcoholism is what happens when somebody drinks, not whether or not they can stop. When we were looking for a new place for our group to meet a few years ago, we had to move off of Buffalo Road. I pulled in one day, and there was a guy standing outside this little church, and turned out he was the minister. Didn't take me long to figure out he didn't want us there, but we were visiting a little while. And so I was telling him about Alcoholics Anonymous and what we do, and he said, I didn't need any of that. He said, God called me out of DTs 23 years ago. And he explained his drinking. It sounded as bad as any of us in here. And now he's 23 years sober. So if you get in these particularly fundamentalist churches, there's a whole bunch of people in there sober. And when they go down, they call it backslide. Doesn't matter much what they call it if you're drunk. What's that old saying? My great aunt used to call, how was that? A rose under any other name remains a rose still. So it's been a terrible problem forever. We're going to start with the Washingtonians, and that's what you don't want me to mess with, Jim? All right. I'll try to fly through there pretty quick. One of the things that the Washingtonians caught on right away. Now, it didn't help us any because when they contacted, it was a man, I don't think anybody's ever found out who this is. But there was a man in North Carolina who contacted Bill Wilson in the early days prior to the traditions and said, we're going to end up like the Washingtonians. Bill was you could say what you want about Bill. I know a guy that he was a finalist some years ago. This is some years ago. But he's a major league executive, and they were interested in him for the General Service Office manager. Well, he studied all the archives about Bill, and he told me, it was a private conversation, but he said, man, they needed to throw a net over that guy. You know, he's way out there. So this alcoholism has always been around, but it didn't help us much because Bill had never heard of the Washingtonians. But one thing the Washingtonians found out was that sense of identification is paramount. We live and die on that in Alcoholics Anonymous. Our history makes clear is our need for each other. The way that would work in real time, if I'm going to get drunk today, the first thing I've got to do is get away from you. Not just literally, I've got to get away from you figuratively. I've recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. There's one place in the book where it says from a hopeless state, not seemingly. So I'd have to get away from you. So our need for each other, I like to look at it like this. No identification, no 12 steps, no Alcoholics Anonymous. But the Washingtonians found a good bit of the answer pretty quick. No cell phones, no nothing. I guess they probably had some kind of mail. But depending on who you believe, you know, I think that Bill himself said 150,000 people. Some of those facts like that I think could be wrong. I don't know about my recall. But some people have said there were 250,000 people, whatever it was. I do know this. I read this myself. Abraham Lincoln was one of the speakers one time. And the Washingtonians, I think, started in a bar in Baltimore where they gathered up, I think there were 5 alcoholics that were decided they'd try to stick together and do something about their drinking. And they found that they were able to stay sober. They got some heat early on by saying, you know, each of you are drunks. Now you're going to stay sober by putting 5 drunks together. I mean, it doesn't make much sense. The problem is with that not making sense is it does work. We can do together what we can't do alone. But they didn't stick to that. They started getting involved in other things. They got involved in the wet-dry issue, which is interesting. The country didn't go for that prohibition when it came out. They got involved in the slavery, anti-slavery movement, choosing sides and all of that. They started going for famous people, which again makes some sense. If you're going to attract people, all of that makes some sense. It just doesn't work. If I'm not mistaken, I could have these reversed. If I'm not mistaken, Bill Wilson said our single greatest safeguard is anonymity. I think that's right. And if I'm not mistaken, he said our second greatest single safeguard is singleness of purpose. I could be wrong about that. Could have them turned around, but I think that's right. Well, it wasn't long before the Washingtonians had fell apart, and they went so far away that whatever I started to say that a minute ago, whatever one might think about Bill Wilson, he was brilliant. I mean, most of us. I have a sister-in-law. I don't know how this happened to me. I'm a high-ranking GED, but I married into a family of head doctors. All my wife's sisters and her brother and her brothers-in-law, they're all head doctors, and one of them writes books. But that's a pretty formidable undertaking. You know, I mean, I wrote for judges for years, and I tried to write a book in my job. It was like a manual, and I wasn't able to do it. I got it to a guy that worked with us. He wrote manuals when he was in the military. He was an aircraft mechanic, so he was more geared to that kind of writing. But, you know, Bill's just a guy off of the street that wrote a book. Not only one book, he wrote a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, he left us with so much stuff and it's also good to deliberate over the fact that Alcoholics Anonymous is a written program. It's passed on through an oral tradition, but it's a written program. It's written down. It tells us the book Alcoholics Anonymous tells you exactly what to do. It'll tell you exactly what not to do. It tells you there's 3 places. There may be more. I know of 3 places that says you're liable to drink if you don't do what it says. On the 4-step sex instructions, it says if your conduct continues to harm others, that's probably more than just sex, harming others, period. If you don't do the 5th step, it says the best reason first, you may not overcome drinking. And then on financial amends, it says if you're afraid to make financial amends, probably aren't going to overcome drinking. So how did he know those things? I mean, where did that come from? What was he sober, 4 years or something like that? He got sober in, I think, November of 1934. And what did he write the book, in 1938? Or whenever it was. I wasn't there with a flashlight. But whenever that was, I mean, it's pretty powerful. So the next thing that came along, and again, there's lots of stuff going on. There's people looking for answers. But the Oxford Group Movement and Roland Hazard, who's the guy mentioned in the big book that was treated by Carl Jung. In 2008, I think, Tom Ivester, we were guests in Rhode Island. And we talked on the steps all weekend in Roland Hazard's hometown. They donated the library. They were the Rockefellers of Rhode Island. They built the library there, all kinds of stuff. And we actually went out there Sunday morning to Roland Hazard's gravesite and said some prayers. Tom made a talk out there about Roland Hazard's contribution. But Roland Hazard was, wealthy families have people they hide. And they did all kinds of things with him, but he's still drunk. And they sent him, where is it, Switzerland? Is that where he went to meet with Carl Jung? And after a year, that's a considerable length of time, he thought it would be impossible for him to drink again, that he had found the answer. Now, information makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, you would information, when you look at the illness of alcoholism, the reason I call it an illness, that's what the book calls it, an illness or a malady. I don't think they use the word disease. I ain't seen our founders use that word. They might have. I haven't seen it. But it makes sense. I would never think, if I knew why my nose was broke, it wouldn't be broke anymore. That doesn't make any sense. But information seems like it will take care of alcoholism. It won't. There's probably not a person in this room doesn't have all the information they need to take care of their alcoholism. What I need is power. So when this thing came about, what happened is Roland Hazard left Carl Jung and thought he would never drink again. Now, I don't know, I haven't read this, but I heard one guy say he ended up face down in a mud puddle in Paris. I don't know if he did or not, but I know he went drunk by his own admission. And he contacted Carl Jung, who told him that you're hopeless, you need to hire a lock and key, get a bodyguard, something, unless something happens. He asked, is there no exception? And Dr. Jung said, yes, there is. There's exceptions to cases such as yours. I don't understand them, but I've learned about them in my reading, and they're called spiritual rearrangements. Now, what's fascinating to me is the correspondence that Carl Jung had with Bill Wilson. And Bill Wilson was pretty good about writing people, certainly better than I've been as a letter writer and most people that I've known. But he was late writing Carl Jung, and he just got him not long before Carl Jung went on out of here. And I'm really grateful he did, because Carl Jung answered him. It's a very instructive letter if you're interested in what he said. He said, I've often wondered what happened to Roland Hazard. I've had no information since then, but I've often wondered. And he was very happy to hear. But he said that he had to be very careful in his use of words. And Carl Jung has been, if you're interested in all that, he's been, I don't know what the right word, but some people have thought he was more interested in spiritual matters than he was psychological or medical. He was an MD psychiatrist, but he was interested in spiritual things, and some people have accused him of tipping over and going off the deep end with some. I don't know if he did or not. I know he played a rich part in our history, because what he ended up telling Bill Wilson, as far as he could tell, the alcoholic's thirst for alcohol was on a low level like man's thirst for God. You know how you hear alcoholics describe it like there's a hole? We used to have a woman in Omaha, she said right below her boobs would be a hole, and it was like cold wind blew through there. And alcohol filled that up. And then comes the day when that doesn't happen. When people say, I had a guy ask me a while back in our group, he said, what does that mean when people say alcohol quit working? I said, well, it doesn't mean you can't get drunk. It just means you can't stop the madness. You know, I used to get drunk and I'd sleep for 12 or 14 hours, and then in the last couple of years of my drinking, I'm homeless. I get drunk and I'm wake up in an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and I'm like that madness is on me. It's insane. I need a drink. I'm terrified. So Carl Jung said that it's on a low level like man's thirst for God, and he also said that the unaided person on their own, it's too much. It's too much. And he used words that this is just my take on it again. I'm not a head doctor, but my take is he left it to us to define the words. He used the word devil. I don't know if he meant a literal devil or if he meant, the devil in the life that alcohol's given us. But he said that it's too much, that it demands some kind of power and other people. Well, that's what we have in Alcoholics Anonymous. There's power in this room. I mean, you don't have to be very smart to know that people will do horrible things together that they wouldn't do alone. The riots prove that. And people will do wonderful things, and, we can stay sober together when we couldn't stay sober beside ourselves. So, what Carl Jung told us was very true, and he said that we've got to be banded together somehow. So he told Roland Hazard that you need to try to find that. You need to try to find a spiritual awakening. So long story short, he ended up finding that. There's some question. I listened to an excellent history talk Thursday night. Dixon did it. We have a table full of women back there that were there. Dixon from Fayetteville did it. It was outstanding. He said that Roland Hazard stayed sober the rest of his life. I think there's question about that. He's like the other people. If I can remember at the end of this talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the personalities involved, because all of these people that were fundamental in getting us going have had terrible things happen. I think Roland Hazard's son or brother flew an airplane into the side of a mountain. There's question whether he stayed sober or not the rest of his life. I mean, I certainly don't know. But I know that history afforded him with a pretty powerful thing, because long story short, they moved in and got Ebby Thatcher sober. And Ebby Thatcher ended up, Bill Wilson referred to him all his life as his sponsor. Now, I heard two people talk about that, both of them sober a long time. One of them, first of all, there ain't many of us want a drunk sponsor. We learned at the International Convention in Minneapolis in 2000. What's that guy's name, Reed, from Texas? There's a guy from Texas that said he's a famous guy. I think he started one of the first treatment centers. And he was good friends with Bill Wilson. He was Ebby's sponsor. He claimed that Ebby got sober and stayed sober the last 2 years of his life. But he was in and out, drunk and sober, and he had a lot of resentments about Bill getting all the credit. So Bill referring to Ebby as his sponsor, there ain't many of us want a drunk sponsor. And one of the guys that talked about that said that what Bill really was he helped keep Ebby drunk. He paid his bills, and I hate this word, it makes my gums hurt, but he was like an enabler. And the other guy that talked about it in terms that Bill showed great humility by saying that Ebby was his sponsor. And I don't know. I don't want a drunk sponsor. I know that. But anyway, Ebby got sober, and his alcoholism was probably every bit as bad or worse than Bill's. Him and Bill had been drunk one time. They chartered an airplane. They landed the airplane and got out of it and fell down. I don't think they were flying it. Reed's in pretty good company. He checked out of a company airplane, kept it out about a week drunk. That's how he got in AA. Owners of the airplane, people he worked for, hadn't even seen the plane yet. I think that's right. I think they fell down drunk. I know they did. I read that in the magazine. But anyway, Ebby, I don't think he was as enamored with the Oxford group tenets as some of what has been written. Other people have written different stuff. But he went to see Bill Wilson. That's one of the tenets. I think the Oxford group ended up, they have 4 things: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love, I think. And Bill never liked those. He said alcoholics don't do anything in an absolute manner, which is probably true. We had, way back, it used to say that you had to have an honest desire to join Alcoholics Anonymous. Now you just have to have a desire. Probably change that too. But anyway, not many of us have our absolute. But that's still, I've done a weekend thing in Akron before. I've also went on the history tour in Akron twice. Anybody can go to Akron, contact the central office, and someone will come and get you and spend all day with you, taking you around. Take you to the Mayflower Hotel, which is an old people's, I think it's called a hostel. Is that right? Hostel. We were in there walking around. This old lady was coming out with her granddaughter, and we told her we were from AA and we wanted to go in. She said, well, just go then. So she let us in, and while we were in there, a fire alarm went off. And so we were walking through there, Reed and J.W. and me, and this policeman stopped us. He was moving through there pretty fast. I mean, he was obviously on assignment. And he said, what are you doing? And we said, we're from AA. And he said, oh, you want to see the phone, don't you? Now, I don't think the phone's there anymore, is it? I don't think it is. But we went and saw. So you can go to the Mayflower. You can go to Dr. Bob's home. I remember when they did that. I can't remember how that worked, but we can't own property. So it was bought by a foundation. Tom Ivester, by the way, was one of the first people on the board of directors. Let's see what else. They take you to Dr. Bob and Ann's grave. They take you to the King County School Group, which was Dr. Bob's home group. They take you to the hospital, the two hospitals there where they worked. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. You can actually walk all around there. You can have a coffee at Dr. Bob and Ann's kitchen table. I mean, it's really a moving experience. You can see his library. He's known to have said, it's written down several places in our history, that he read an hour a day all his life. I'll assure you this, he wasn't as drunk as I was if he was reading an hour a day. But all that is just, it's fascinating. So we're up to the Oxford group, and I could be wrong about this, but I think Dr. Bob and Ann joined the Oxford group in 1937. I think Bill a little bit later. And we can be very grateful about one thing. It's irrefutable that when Bill Wilson got a hold of something, he never backed down until he got his way or was totally defeated. Or he stuck with stuff. He was, saw stuff through. And the Oxford group actually put out a letter that said Bill and Lois weren't maximum in terms of Oxford group tenets. They wanted to change the whole world. They had a term about first century Christianity. If your neighbor doesn't have a coat, give him yours. They had all kinds of stuff like that. Well, Bill wanted to work with alcoholics. And so he was described as not maximum. Thank God for us. There's lots of places in this where things could have went south had it not went the way that it did. Also in Akron, Ohio, there's a guy, he's buried right down here in, I think, is it Cameron, North Carolina? Right, Clarence Snyder is buried right down here. Tom Ivester was one of the pallbearers, was at his funeral. Very small funeral, but Clarence was one of the first AA members. Clarence, I heard him speak in person. He claimed to be one of the founders. I get Nell Wing, and there's another woman. What's her name? Marty. Is that her? Who was the first archivist? Woman archivist. You don't know, Newt? Okay. Well, anyway, she said that had Clarence not had such a fractious personality, that history would have afforded him an equal founder's role. He claimed to have been the one that named Alcoholics Anonymous. He was down the road in Cleveland. He was bringing a carload of guys up he was sponsored by Dr. Bob. And I think it is true that he wrote the first pamphlet. He wrote a pamphlet on sponsorship. And all through his talk, he said, the term he used is, they'd send alcoholics to me and I'd fix them. He used that all through his talk. And Dr. Bob told him to write it down because he was having a lot of luck with it. Well, they would come up from Cleveland every week to Akron. to the Oxford group meetings. Well, a lot of the people that were coming from Cleveland were Catholic, and the Catholic community, the priests, were not a fan of them going to that. So Clarence told Dr. Bob one day, it's crazy for us to keep coming up here. We're just going to start our own meeting. So they started an AA meeting in Akron. Well, Clarence never liked Bill Wilson. He claimed that, Bill was a terrible writer when I heard him talk. He said, we're not supposed to, we're attraction. What's the other one? Affiliation. He had something about those words. He said there wasn't a bit of difference between them and all of that. So all of that is very interesting. But there is a book. Mel Barger wrote a book about Ebby Thatcher, and there's also a book about Clarence Snyder that's written if you're interested in. There's books about all these people. There's a book about Sister Ignatia, which is a fascinating book. But anyway, so what happened is that Bill quit going to the Oxford group. Dr. Bob hung in there longer because of his allegiance to him. He had gotten honest with him about his problem before Bill Wilson called on him. I'm going to have to hurry this up. I'm going to look at, I want to make sure, I want to talk about some of these people. If you look at some of the miraculous things, you have to get the idea pretty quick that there's too much heavy-duty stuff here for coincidence. I've heard people talk about that time between Bill Wilson getting sober in November of 1934 and when he talked to Dr. Bob a little bit later. What was that, June 10th? It's interesting to me, too, that we call Bill Wilson carried the message to Dr. Bob. We date the birth of our society from Dr. Bob's first day sober. I mean, that's interesting to me. And we don't call the date of our society Bill Wilson's sobriety. We call it the date he hit a home run. So between that period when Bill Wilson first started working with people till he carried the message to Dr. Bob, I've heard people describe that as Bill worked with from 75 to 100 alcoholics, none of which had stayed sober. He told Lois that I'm tired of this, I'm going to get a job, nobody stayed sober. She said, she came up with that. She said, well, Bill, you have. And I heard a guy tell that story. He said he asked Lois where that came from, and she said, I don't know. It just made sense to me. I didn't say anything when he first said it, and then it just made sense to me. Well, Bill, you have. You've stayed sober. So here's something miraculous, though. Nobody had gotten sober. In fact, is it even in the big book, one guy committed suicide in Bill and Lois's house. Nobody had got sober. Dr. Silkworth sat Bill Wilson down and said, you've got to quit preaching to people and talking about your hot light experience. You need to hit them with the hopelessness of the illness. Then you can come in and do this other stuff. The very first person that Bill Wilson did that with, Eureka, was Dr. Bob. Got sober, got drunk one time, never drank again. They did it 3 weeks later, whatever that was, with AA number 3, the man on the bed, Bill Dotson, never drank again. So again, a non-alcoholic rides to the rescue. And people have often thought that Dr. Silkworth got interested in alcoholism because of Bill Wilson. That's not true. He couldn't explain why he was interested in alcoholism. When he was a medical doctor who did his residency in psychiatric medicine, just like a surgeon does theirs. We got a girl in our group that's Sandy's their sponsor. She's an emergency room physician. So Tanya did her residency in emergency room medicine. Well, Dr. Silkworth did his in psychiatric medicine, and he said that he could not explain what his fascination was with alcoholics, but he had the idea, just like everybody else, if he could find out why these people were drinking, maybe he could do something to help them quit drinking. Well, he never could do that. But look at what look at what he did. If you talk about AA would be well, first of all, you can back it even further than that. We'd have never got AA going had it not been for non-alcoholics, particularly in medicine and religion. Never got them going, never would have kept them going. I spent a whole weekend with a guy named Jim Estelle. When my wife and I watch TV together, we watch the crime channels. And Jim Estelle is the former Secretary of Correction from Texas. He spent like 15 years or something as an AA servant. I think he was a non-alcoholic chairman of World Services. So we've been served by all kinds of non-alcoholics, including Dr. Silkworth. But he played a tremendous role. I certainly don't think you could have an alcoholic founder, but he's pretty close to an equal founder. I mean, they never would have. Those guys worked with Bill Wilson throughout. And Father Ed Dowling, the Jesuit priest, there's a whole book written about that. What's interesting is Bill was in the clubhouse on whatever street it was, and he was upstairs, and it was raining, and the watchman said that there's somebody wants to see you. And Bill thought it was another drunk until Father took off his raincoat and he saw the collar. And Father Dowling was a Jesuit, the order of priests and brothers, and when he looked at the 12 steps, he said, "My God, never had I seen the writings of St. Aquinas St. Ignatia so clearly illuminated." And the question he asked Bill Wilson seems like a reasonable question. He said, "Have you done those?" Bill Wilson said, "I wrote those." He said, that ain't what I asked. I think he said he'd done some of them. But the truth of the matter, now I don't know this, I'm not saying it definitively, but I would say there's a good bet that there's nobody had done the 12 steps in order when that book was written. All of this stuff got a whole lot more true after it was written down. Got a whole lot more true. So, let's see if I got time for a couple. I got 5 minutes, 6 minutes. Sister Ignatia, if you look at what she did for us, she was not a nurse. She probably ended up doing a lot of nursing stuff. She was a music teacher. In those days, there were a lot more nuns. She'd had a nervous breakdown, and her order put her in the hospital to lick her wounds. I was actually doing one of these things in Akron where you talk on the steps all weekend, and there was a guy there. I was still working, so it was before 2008, and he could barely walk then. He was all bent over, but he actually worked for Sister Ignatia, and he told wonderful stories. He was just there. He said he was a bedpan. He emptied bedpans. He got a job as a tech. But he told fascinating stories about Sister Ignatia. He said her word was law with the drunks. He said the stuff that ain't written down, like that if Sister Ignatia wanted something and the hospital wouldn't give it to her, she would go home like on Friday night, and after they'd been there for a while, word would go out with the drunks. So they had plumbers, carpenters, all kinds of stuff. They'd come in on Monday morning, there'd be a wall knocked down, there'd be all this stuff, and Sister's fat, dumb, and happy. She don't know a thing in the world about it. Of course, she's in on it, but she don't know. But that's what they got. Her word was law with the drunks. She's actually probably the foundress of our idea about chips. I think it was the Sacred Heart medal. I could be wrong about that, but she gave everybody a medal from her order before they left the hospital, and she told them to return it if they were going to drink. So her part in our history is incredible. There's some stuff hanging in the hospitals there. She wouldn't allow a ward to be named after her, but they have put up some stuff that's very interesting. All right, 4 minutes. I'll tell you a couple stories. There were two people that lived in Omaha the last many years of their life that were, there's a guy named Dan Golden. I sobered up on the second edition Big Book, and there was a story in there called The Man Who Mastered Fear. It might have made it into the third edition, I'm not sure. His name was Archie Throwbridge. And he sobered up under Dr. Bob and Ann. He lived in their home for a year. At the end of a year, Archie went back to Detroit, where he was from, to start AA there. And Dan Golden was a member of that group. Archie was his sponsor, and they would go to Dr. Bob and Ann's house on weekends to hang out. Ann Smith is on record of telling Archie when he left that you'll always have a home with us. They were uncertain about whether he should go, whether he was ready to go at the end of the year or not, but he felt inspired to do it, and he pulled it off. He started the first AA group. But we would get Dan Golden to tell us stories. And about Dr. Bob and Ann, and when he talked, he growled, and he called a talk deliver. Like he said, I told him to be over there tomorrow night, I'm going to deliver over there. But it was fascinating, because there was a lot of people that knew Bill Wilson, but not that many people that knew Dr. Bob. And he had all kinds of trivia about Dr. Bob. Some of it's written down, Dr. Bob would go to King County School Group, and he'd get 4 cups of coffee and put them up in the window so they could cool off, so he could drink them during the meeting. He'd drink 4 cups. He didn't want to get up. And there was a guy named Gene Salazar. I knew him very well. Gene Salazar was the 3rd speaker in Jackson Prison that Tom Ivester heard. Gene lived in Chicago at that time. And in the book, I think it's Dr. Bob and the Old Timers, don't hold me to that. There's a picture of Bill Wilson standing at Dr. Bob's grave, and it says, photo by Gene S. Gene took that picture. He gave me my own copy. I have a copy of it. But he would also tell us stories about the early days, and because all of this stuff that's written down, but it's not like if you pile a carload of people up and go to Richmond, I mean, that can be a pretty rich experience, right? I mean, all kinds of stuff that could be told out of that probably wouldn't be appropriate to write down. So that kind of history was fascinating and passed on. What history does is it makes today relevant, whether it's family history or any kind of history. Without history, there's been a few people that, this happened to a guy in Omaha, he was a public figure, claimed that he dropped out, and he claimed that his mind went out and never came back. He didn't have any recall. I guess that happens to some people. That'd be a pretty tough way to live when there was no yesterday. So that's some thoughts on history. It's by no means a definitive thing. It's a very short period of time, an hour. So what I always try to do is like a talk on history or whatever, is that if you're interested in the history, there's a tremendous amount of stuff written down. I mean, there's no end. We could study this stuff for the rest of our lives. Bill Wilson wrote so much stuff that he often cancels himself out. They claim that about the Bible too, that it'll contradict itself. I suppose that's, for any of us if you talk long enough and write enough. So that's about what I know, and I think Bree's going to feed us. Bree doesn't know this, but what's that minister's name, Angela? Was that her name? Took that picture with us? Andrea. Yeah. Well, they took a picture of Bree and Andrea and I had Andrea cut out of the picture. And I put Bree and me up on Facebook, and I said, this is my new girlfriend. Thank you.